What if everything you thought you knew about a painting was hiding a secret right in front of your eyes? In 1892, a portrait emerged from a small studio in Boston that seemed unremarkable at first glance. Just another image of a grieving widow draped in the heavy fabrics of mourning, her face etched with sorrow. But there was something different about this one, something that art historians would overlook for decades, something concealed in the delicate positioning of her hand. The Victorian era was obsessed with death, with rituals of mourning that extended for years, with portraits that captured grief in its purest form. Yet this painting held more than grief. It held a story that would eventually unravel a mystery spanning generations. The studio building on Tremont Street in Boston was a hub of artistic activity in the late 19th century. Artists gathered in cramped spaces, their brushes moving across canvases while the city bustled below. The building had survived the Civil War, economic downturns, and the shifting tides of artistic fashion. By 1892, it housed painters, sculptors, and photographers, all vying for recognition in a city that prided itself on cultural refinement. Among them was a lesser-known portrait artist named Samuel Whitmore, a man whose work rarely made it into the prestigious exhibitions at the Boston Art Club, but whose technical skill was undeniable. Samuel had been commissioned that winter by a wealthy family from Beacon Hill. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Paint a memorial portrait of Margaret Ashford, a woman who had lost her husband in a tragic accident involving a steamship that went down off the coast of Cape Cod just months earlier. The family wanted something traditional, something that would honor her grief while capturing the dignity expected of their social standing. Margaret was 32 years old, still young by any measure, but the loss had aged her visibly. When she arrived at Samuel's studio for the first sitting in early February, the winter light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the room. She wore black, as was customary. The fabric was heavy silk adorned with jet beads that caught the light in small, mournful glints. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hollowness in her eyes. Samuel began with preliminary sketches, studying the angles of her face, the way she held herself with a rigid composure that suggested she was barely holding together. But it was her hands that caught his attention. Most subjects didn't know what to do with their hands during a sitting. They fidgeted, clasped them together awkwardly, or let them fall limp in their laps. Margaret, however, held her left hand in a very specific position, fingers slightly curved, resting against her chest with her thumb pressed firmly against her palm in a gesture that seemed both natural and deliberate. Over the course of 6 sittings that stretched into March, Samuel worked on the portrait with meticulous care. He captured the texture of her mourning dress, the pale luminosity of her skin against the dark fabric, the way her eyes seemed to look through the viewer rather than at them. But each time he approached the rendering of her hand, he hesitated. There was something about the way she positioned it that felt significant, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He asked her about it during their 4th session, keeping his tone casual as he mixed pigments on his palette. Margaret's response was measured, her voice barely above a whisper. She said it was simply comfortable, a habit she'd developed. But her eyes told a different story. They flickered with something Samuel recognized as fear, or perhaps warning. The portrait was completed by late March. The Ashford family approved it immediately, praising Samuel's ability to capture Margaret's dignified sorrow. The painting was hung in their Beacon Hill townhouse, where it would remain for the next 30 years, largely forgotten except by family members who passed it daily in the upstairs hallway. Samuel never forgot it, though. He kept his preliminary sketches, tucked away in a leather portfolio that eventually found its way to his daughter after his death in 1903. The hand in that portrait haunted him in ways he couldn't explain, a puzzle he never quite solved. Boston in 1892 was a city of contrasts. Gleaming brownstones stood alongside immigrant tenements. Horse-drawn carriages shared cobblestone streets with the new electric trolleys, and old money families maintained their grip on society while a new generation of entrepreneurs challenged the established order. The Ashford family epitomized old Boston wealth. Their fortune had been built on shipping and textile mills, industries that had made Massachusetts prosperous in the decades following the Revolution. Edward Ashford, Margaret's late husband, had been the third generation to manage the family business, and by all accounts he had been good at it. The accident that claimed Edward's life occurred on a grey November morning in 1891. He was travelling aboard the steamship Meridian, inspecting one of the family's cargo operations along the Massachusetts coast. The ship encountered unexpected rough seas off Provincetown, and a rogue wave swept 3 men overboard, Edward among them. His body was recovered 2 days later, washed up on a beach near Truro. The funeral was attended by Boston's elite, and Margaret became an instant object of sympathy and speculation. She was young, beautiful despite her grief, and now controlled a considerable fortune through her late husband's estate. The vultures circled, as they always did, around wealth and tragedy. But Margaret withdrew from society entirely. She moved from the couple's home on Commonwealth Avenue into the Ashford family mansion on Beacon Hill, where Edward's elderly mother still resided. The arrangement suited both women. The elder Mrs. Ashford needed care in her declining years, and Margaret needed sanctuary from the prying eyes and calculating minds of Boston society. She wore black for a full year, as was expected, and even after the traditional mourning period ended, she showed no interest in re-entering social life. Friends who called were turned away politely but firmly. Invitations went unanswered. The woman who had once been known for her grace at dinner parties and her skill at the piano seemed to have disappeared into grief. What no one outside the family knew was that Margaret's withdrawal had less to do with grief and more to do with fear. Edward's death had not been an accident, or at least she didn't believe it was. In the weeks before his final voyage, he had been agitated, distracted in ways that were unlike him. He mentioned problems with the business, discrepancies in the accounting books, shipments that didn't match records. When Margaret pressed him for details, Edward became evasive, telling her only that he was looking into matters that required discretion. Then came that November morning, and Edward was gone, taking whatever secrets he had discovered with him into the cold Atlantic waters. Margaret found the letter 3 days after the funeral. She had been going through Edward's personal effects, a task she had delayed as long as possible, when she discovered it tucked inside a book in his study, a volume of Emerson's essays that Edward had been reading the week before his death. The letter was written in Edward's hand, dated just 2 days before his voyage. It was addressed to her, to be opened only if something happened to him. The words were careful, coded in language that might seem innocuous to anyone else but were crystal clear to Margaret. Edward had discovered that someone within the family business was embezzling large sums of money, falsifying records, and using the company's shipping operations to transport goods that Edward suspected were illegal. He didn't name the person directly, but he mentioned enough details that Margaret understood the implications were dangerous. The letter ended with specific instructions. If anything happened to him, Margaret was to trust no one in the family business. She was to keep the information to herself until she could verify the truth through independent means. And most importantly, she was to protect herself by appearing to know nothing. Edward had included a single line that chilled her. "They are watching and they know I'm close to the truth." Margaret burned the letter immediately after reading it, but the words stayed with her, settling into her bones like a winter frost that never quite thawed. From that moment forward, every interaction, every conversation, every gesture became a careful calculation. She couldn't trust anyone, not even members of Edward's own family, because she didn't know who might be involved. The portrait sitting with Samuel Whitmore had been arranged by Edward's cousin, Charles Ashford, who managed much of the family's business affairs after Edward's death. Margaret had no choice but to comply. Refusing would have raised suspicions and questions she couldn't afford to answer. So she sat for the portrait, maintaining the facade of the grieving widow, while her mind worked constantly to piece together the puzzle Edward had left behind. The gesture with her hand, the one Samuel had noticed, was not habitual at all. It was deliberate, her silent signal that Margaret hoped someone someday might understand. It was a sign from the mourning jewelry tradition, a language that Victorian society understood well, a way of communicating messages through seemingly innocent gestures and symbols. But whether anyone would ever recognize it, Margaret didn't know. The years passed slowly for Margaret Ashford. The portrait hung in the Beacon Hill mansion, a constant reminder of those tense weeks in Samuel Whitmore's studio. of the secret she carried, of the life she had lost. The elder Mrs. Ashford died in 1895, leaving Margaret as the sole occupant of the massive house. She continued to live quietly, managing her affairs through trusted lawyers and avoiding any direct involvement in the family shipping business. Charles Ashford, who had assumed control after Edward's death, visited occasionally to provide updates on company matters, always courteous, always solicitous of her well-being. Margaret listened politely and said little, playing the role of the disinterested widow who was content to receive her dividends and ask no questions. But privately, Margaret was anything but disinterested. She had spent the years since Edward's death conducting her own careful investigation, hiring private inquiry agents who asked questions discreetly, reviewing financial documents that came to her as part of her inheritance rights, piecing together a picture that grew increasingly clear and increasingly damning. Edward had been right about the embezzlement, and it was far more extensive than his letter had suggested. Money had been systematically diverted from the Ashford shipping operations for more than a decade, hidden through complex accounting manipulations that required intimate knowledge of the business. The illegal goods Edward had suspected were real as well. Opium smuggled through the company's legitimate trade routes with the Orient, hidden in cargo manifests, and distributed through contacts in Boston's immigrant neighborhoods. The person behind it all was Charles, Edward's own cousin, the man who now sat in Edward's office, who made sympathetic visits to the grieving widow, who presented himself as the family's trusted steward. Margaret had confirmed it through painstaking work, cross-referencing shipping records with bank deposits, tracking the movement of money through intermediaries, following trails that led inevitably back to Charles. But confirmation was one thing. Proof that would stand up in court was another matter entirely. Charles had been careful, insulating himself with layers of associates and false documentation. Going to the authorities without ironclad evidence would accomplish nothing except alerting Charles that she knew, putting her own life in immediate danger. By 1900, Margaret had developed a plan. She would document everything meticulously, creating a comprehensive record of Charles's criminal activities that could be turned over to prosecutors when the time was right. She stored the documents in a safe deposit box at a bank outside of Boston, a place Charles would have no reason to suspect or access. And she took one additional precaution. She wrote a letter to be delivered to the district attorney's office in the event of her unexpected death, explaining everything and directing investigators to the evidence. The letter was held by her lawyer, a man she trusted completely, with strict instructions about its delivery. If she died suddenly or under suspicious circumstances, the truth would come out. Charles would be exposed, and Edward would be vindicated. But Margaret also knew she needed insurance, a backup plan in case something went wrong with her carefully constructed safeguards. That's when she thought of the portrait. She retrieved it from the upstairs hallway, where it had hung largely unnoticed for years, and examined it closely, studying Samuel Whitmore's rendering of her hand, the gesture she had maintained through all those sittings. The hand position was there, captured perfectly, a visual record of what she had been trying to communicate. But the gesture alone wasn't enough. It could be interpreted many ways and most people wouldn't even notice it. She needed something more concrete, something hidden within the painting itself that could be discovered if someone knew to look for it. Margaret contacted a different artist, a woman named Eleanor Price, who specialized in restoration and conservation work. She told Eleanor that the portrait had suffered some minor damage and needed cleaning and repair. It was a believable lie. The painting was 8 years old and showed signs of age. Eleanor agreed to take on the work, and Margaret delivered the portrait to her studio in the South End. But before she did, Margaret had carefully removed the painting from its frame and made a small addition to the canvas, working late at night in the Beacon Hill mansion with materials she had purchased discreetly. Using a fine-tipped brush and paint that matched the original pigments as closely as possible, she added something to the area around her painted hand, something that would be invisible to casual observation, but could be revealed through close examination. When Eleanor Price cleaned the portrait and made her repairs, she noticed nothing unusual. The painting was returned to Margaret, reframed, and rehung in the mansion. To anyone looking at it, the portrait appeared exactly as it had before, The same grieving widow in her mourning dress, the same enigmatic expression, the same carefully positioned hand. But now it contained a secret, a message encoded in paint, waiting for someone with the knowledge and motivation to find it. Margaret felt a small measure of relief. She had done what she could to protect herself and to ensure that the truth about Edward's death wouldn't die with her. Now she could only wait and hope that if the worst happened, someone would eventually look closely enough at the portrait to see what she had hidden there in plain sight. The years between 1900 and 1922 were quiet ones for Margaret Ashford. She aged gracefully, her hair turning silver, her face settling into lines that spoke of sorrow but also of resilience. She never remarried, despite occasional interest from Boston's eligible widowers. The Ashford shipping business continued to prosper under Charles's management, at least on the surface, and Margaret continued to receive her dividends without comment or question. Charles grew wealthy and prominent, serving on charitable boards, hosting elegant parties, becoming exactly the sort of respectable businessman that Boston society admired. No one suspected what Margaret knew, because she gave them no reason to suspect that she knew anything at all. But Margaret's health began to decline in 1920. She developed a persistent cough that doctors attributed to a weak constitution, and by the following year it was clear that she was seriously ill. Tuberculosis, the doctors said, likely contracted years earlier and now progressing despite their best efforts at treatment. She was 62 years old, and she knew her time was limited. The question that consumed her final months was whether she should act on what she knew about Charles or take the secret to her grave. The evidence she had compiled was still in the safe deposit box, the letter still held by her lawyer. But Charles was now in his late 60s himself, and the crimes she could prove had occurred decades ago. Would anyone care? Would prosecution even be possible after so much time? In the end, Margaret decided to let the safeguards she had put in place stand as they were. If she died naturally of illness, the letter wouldn't be delivered. Those were her instructions. The evidence would remain locked away, a record of crimes that would never be prosecuted. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was a kind of weary pragmatism. Edward was long dead, and revenge wouldn't bring him back. Charles had lived his life as he chose, and Margaret had lived hers. The only thing that mattered now was that the truth was documented somewhere, even if it never came to light. She revised her will to leave the Beacon Hill mansion and its contents, including the portrait, to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, with the stipulation that the portrait be publicly displayed. Margaret died in March of 1922, and her death was noted in the Boston newspapers with respectful obituaries that praised her dignity and her charitable contributions. The lawyer, following her instructions, did not deliver the letter to the district attorney because Margaret's death was clearly from natural causes. The safe deposit box remained sealed, its contents unknown. The Ashford mansion was transferred to the Museum of Fine Arts, which accepted the bequest gratefully. The museum's curators catalogued the contents, including numerous pieces of furniture, artwork, and personal items that Margaret had collected over her lifetime. The portrait was listed among them, Portrait of a Widow, oil on canvas by Samuel Whitmore, 1892, and was initially placed in storage while the museum decided how best to display or use the acquisition. Charles Ashford died less than a year later, in January of 1923, at the age of 69. He suffered a stroke while at his office and never regained consciousness. His obituary was far more prominent than Margaret's had been, lauding his business acumen and his contributions to Boston's commercial success. The Ashford shipping business was sold to a larger firm, and the family name gradually faded from prominence as subsequent generations moved away from Boston or pursued different careers. The crimes Charles had committed, the embezzlement and smuggling that had cost Edward his life, remained hidden, known only to Margaret, and now lost with her death. The portrait remained in the Museum of Fine Arts storage for nearly 70 years. It was moved occasionally as the museum reorganized its collection, and it appeared briefly in a small exhibition of 19th-century American portraiture in 1954. But it attracted little attention. Samuel Whitmore was not a well-known artist, and the subject of the painting, an anonymous widow, held no particular historical significance. The museum had thousands of works in its collection, and this particular portrait was simply not a priority for display or study. It languished in climate-controlled storage, carefully preserved but essentially forgotten, the secret Margaret had hidden within it, undiscovered and unsuspected. Then, in 1991, nearly 100 years after the portrait was painted, a graduate student named Jennifer Chen was conducting research for her doctoral dissertation on Victorian mourning practices and their representation in American art. She was examining works in the Museum of Fine Arts collection, looking specifically at portraits of widows and the symbolic elements artists used to convey grief. A curator pulled several works from storage for her to examine, including Samuel Whitmore's portrait of Margaret Ashford. Jennifer spent an afternoon photographing and studying the painting, taking detailed notes on the composition, the costume, the subject's expression. And then she noticed the hand positioned in that specific gesture against the widow's chest, and something about it triggered her academic curiosity. It was a signal, she was almost certain, one of the many coded gestures that Victorian mourners used to communicate complex meanings about their grief, their relationships, their circumstances. Jennifer Chen had spent 3 years researching Victorian mourning culture, immersing herself in the elaborate rituals that governed grief in the 19th century. She knew the prescribed mourning periods, 2 years for widows, 1 year in full black, and another in half mourning with grey and lavender permitted. She understood the symbolism embedded in mourning jewellery, the hair wreaths woven from the deceased's locks, the jet beads that adorned black dresses, the language of flowers that conveyed messages too painful to speak aloud, and she recognized the hand gestures, the subtle positions that mourners used to signal specific meanings about their loss and their relationship to the deceased. The gesture in Margaret Ashford's portrait was unusual. The left hand rested against the chest with fingers slightly curved, but the thumb was pressed firmly against the palm in a way that seemed deliberate rather than natural. Jennifer photographed the detail and compared it to her research notes. Most widow portraits showed hands folded in the lap, or holding a handkerchief, or sometimes clutching a miniature portrait of the deceased husband. This particular positioning didn't match any of the standard mourning gestures she had catalogued. It nagged at her, suggesting that there was something she was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make the gesture's meaning clear. She decided to examine the painting more closely. With the curator's permission, she brought it into better light and studied every inch of the canvas. The paint showed the expected signs of age, minor cracking in places, some darkening of the varnish, but the work was in good condition overall. Samuel Whitmore had been a competent technician, if not a brilliant artist. His rendering of the fabric textures was particularly skilled, capturing the heavy silk of the mourning dress and the subtle sheen of the jet beads. Jennifer moved her examination to the area around the hand, using a magnifying glass to study the fine details of Whitmore's brushwork. That's when she saw it. There, in the shadows between the fingers and the fabric of the dress, was something that didn't quite match the rest of the painting. The brushstrokes were similar but not identical, suggesting a different hand or at least a different moment of application. Jennifer felt her pulse quicken. She had studied enough art restoration to recognize the signs of later addition or modification. Someone had painted something into this area after the original work was completed, something small enough to escape casual notice but visible under close examination. Jennifer immediately contacted the museum's conservation department. Within a week, the portrait was in their lab, undergoing analysis with infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescence. The techniques allowed conservators to see beneath the surface layers of paint, revealing what had been hidden or altered. What they found was extraordinary. Beneath the topmost paint layer, in the area Jennifer had identified, there were letters. Tiny, carefully formed letters, painted in a pigment that was slightly different from the surrounding paint. The letters spelled out a message, a name really, painted so small that they would have been invisible without magnification or technical analysis. The name was Charles Ashford, and beneath it, in equally tiny letters, were the words, "Murdered Edward." Jennifer stood in the conservation lab, staring at the infrared images on the computer screen, trying to process what this meant. Someone had hidden an accusation of murder within this portrait, painted it into the canvas in a way that would remain concealed unless someone knew to look for it. The question was who had done it and why. Had Samuel Whitmore added this message? That seemed unlikely. Why would the artist risk his reputation and possibly his safety to make such an accusation? The more logical explanation was that the subject of the portrait, Margaret Ashford herself, had added the message after the painting was completed. Jennifer began researching the Ashford family history with renewed intensity. She combed through Boston newspaper archives, looking for information about Edward Ashford's death in 1891 and the family's subsequent history. She found the obituaries, the brief mention of the steamship accident, the notices of Margaret's death in 1922. She discovered that Charles Ashford had managed the family shipping business after Edward's death and had died himself in 1923. The dates aligned with what the portrait suggested. Margaret had commissioned the painting in 1892, just months after Edward's death, and had later added the hidden accusation. But why hide it? Why not go to the authorities if she believed Edward had been murdered? The answer, Jennifer realized, was fear. Margaret must have known or suspected that making the accusation openly would put her own life in danger. So she had documented it in the only way she could, hiding the truth within a portrait that she hoped would someday be discovered. It was a message in a bottle, cast into the future with the desperate hope that someone would eventually find it and understand. Jennifer knew she had stumbled onto something significant, not just for her dissertation, but for understanding a piece of Boston's hidden history. She needed to find out if there was any other evidence to support Margaret's accusation, any documentation that could confirm or refute the claim that Charles Ashford had murdered his cousin. Jennifer's research took on new urgency. She contacted genealogical societies, historical archives, and maritime museums, searching for any information about the Ashford family and their shipping business. She learned that the company had been sold in 1923, shortly after Charles Ashford's death, and that the business records had been donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society in the 1950s. Jennifer spent weeks in the society's reading room, going through boxes of shipping manifests, financial ledgers, and correspondence. The records were extensive but disorganized, and it took considerable time to piece together a coherent picture of the business operations. What emerged was troubling. The financial records showed irregularities exactly as Margaret's hidden message suggested. There were discrepancies in the accounting books, shipments that appeared in manifests but had no corresponding invoices, deposits that came from unexplained sources. The pattern was subtle enough that it might have escaped notice by casual auditors, but to Jennifer's trained eye it suggested systematic embezzlement. More disturbing were the shipping routes. Several of the company's vessels had made regular runs to ports in China and Southeast Asia, ostensibly carrying legitimate trade goods like tea and silk. But the manifests showed cargo holds that were never fully accounted for, suggesting smuggling operations. Jennifer found correspondence between Edward Ashford and the company's accountants from late 1891, just weeks before his death. Edward had written several letters questioning specific transactions and requesting detailed explanations for accounting entries that didn't make sense. The responses from the accountants were defensive and evasive, suggesting they were hiding something or protecting someone. The last letter in the sequence was dated November 10th, 1891, 2 days before Edward boarded the Meridian for his final voyage. In it, Edward stated that he would be conducting a personal inspection of cargo operations and that he expected full cooperation from all company employees. The next document in the file was a brief report of Edward's death, written by Charles Ashford, and submitted to the company's board of directors. Charles described the accident as a tragic misfortune, noting that Edward had been swept overboard during unexpectedly rough weather and that his body had been recovered 2 days later. There was no mention of Edward's investigation into the company's finances, no suggestion that his death was anything other than a terrible accident. The board had accepted Charles's report without question, and Charles had assumed control of the business immediately. Within 6 months, he had restructured the accounting practices and replaced several long-term employees, effectively eliminating anyone who might have had knowledge of the previous irregularities. Jennifer now had circumstantial evidence supporting Margaret's accusation, but she needed more. She needed something that would definitively link Charles to Edward's death, something that would prove murder rather than accident. She began researching the Meridian itself, the steamship that had been the site of Edward's death. Maritime records showed that the vessel had been part of the Ashford fleet and had been sold to another company in 1893. Jennifer tracked down the ship's log for November 1891 in the archives of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, which housed extensive maritime records. The log entry for November 12, 1891, described the incident that killed Edward Ashford. According to the ship's captain, the weather had been rough but not exceptionally dangerous. 3 men had been working on deck when a large wave struck the starboard side, washing 2 of them overboard. Edward Ashford had rushed to help and had himself been swept over the rail. The captain noted that rescue attempts had been made immediately, but the rough seas and poor visibility had made recovery impossible. Edward's body had been found 2 days later by fishermen near Truro. The log entry seemed straightforward, supporting the official account of an accidental death. But Jennifer noticed something odd. The other 2 men who had been washed overboard were not identified by name in the log. They were listed simply as crew members. This was unusual for a ship's log, which typically maintained detailed records of all personnel aboard. Jennifer contacted maritime historians and learned that crew members who died in accidents were almost always named in official logs, both for legal purposes and to ensure their families were notified. The absence of names suggested either sloppy record-keeping or deliberate omission. Jennifer wondered if these unnamed men had even existed, or if they were invented to make Edward's death appear part of a larger accident rather than a targeted act. If Charles had arranged Edward's murder, creating the appearance of a freak accident involving multiple victims would have been a clever way to deflect suspicion. Jennifer knew she needed expert help to take her investigation further. She reached out to Dr. Michael Brennan, a professor of American history at Boston University, who specialized in Gilded Age crime and corruption. Dr. Brennan was immediately intrigued by what Jennifer had uncovered. Together, they began building a more comprehensive case, examining not just the Ashford family records, but also broader patterns of crime and corruption in Boston's maritime industry during the 1890s. What they discovered was that the Ashford situation was not unique. Smuggling and embezzlement were relatively common in the shipping trade, facilitated by complex international routes and limited regulatory oversight. Dr. Brennan had contacts in law enforcement history circles, and through them, he learned something remarkable. The Boston Police Department's historical archives contained a file on Charles Ashford, opened in 1901 and closed in 1902, without any charges being filed. The file had been requested by a private citizen who claimed to have information about criminal activities related to the Ashford shipping business. That citizen was Margaret Ashford. Jennifer and Dr. Brennan obtained permission to review the file, which had been stored in the department's cold case archives for nearly a century. The file contained Margaret's detailed allegations against Charles, including documentation of financial irregularities and shipping records that suggested smuggling operations. She had presented evidence that Charles had been systematically embezzling from the company for more than a decade and using Ashford vessels to transport opium from Asia to Boston. Most significantly, she had stated her belief that Charles had arranged Edward's death to prevent discovery of these crimes. The police had investigated, but the case had stalled. Charles Ashford was a prominent businessman with political connections, and the evidence Margaret provided, while suggestive, was not sufficient to secure an indictment. Without witnesses willing to testify or physical evidence directly linking Charles to Edward's death, prosecutors had declined to pursue the case. The file also contained notes from the investigating detective, who had interviewed several former Ashford employees. One interview stood out. A warehouse supervisor who had been fired by Charles in 1892 claimed that Charles had ordered him to falsify cargo manifests and had threatened him when he questioned the practice. The supervisor said he believed Charles was involved in smuggling, but had no direct proof. More tellingly, he mentioned that Charles had been unusually agitated in the days following Edward's death, not with grief, but with what seemed like nervous tension, as if worried about something being discovered. The detective had found this testimony credible but insufficient for prosecution. Jennifer and Dr. Brennan now had a clearer picture of what had happened. Edward Ashford had discovered Charles's criminal activities and had been preparing to expose him. Charles, facing ruin and possible imprisonment, had arranged Edward's death, making it appear as an accident at sea. Margaret had suspected or known the truth, but had been unable to prove it conclusively. She had hidden her accusation in the portrait as a desperate measure, documenting what she believed while protecting herself from Charles's retaliation. She had later gone to the police in 1901, nearly a decade after Edward's death, but by then the trail had gone cold, and Charles's position had only grown stronger. The question remained whether any additional evidence existed that could definitively prove murder. Jennifer returned to the portrait, studying it with fresh eyes. The hidden message naming Charles had been the key that unlocked the investigation, but was there anything else Margaret might have concealed in the painting? She arranged for additional technical analysis, using the most advanced imaging technology available. Conservators employed multispectral imaging, examining the portrait under different wavelengths of light, revealing layers and details invisible to the naked eye. What they found was another surprise. Beneath Margaret's addition of Charles's name, there was an older layer that Samuel Whitmore had painted over. The infrared analysis showed that Whitmore had originally painted Margaret's hand in a slightly different position, more relaxed and natural. He had then repainted it in the specific gesture that appeared in the final portrait. This suggested that Margaret had requested the change during the sittings, asking Whitmore to capture her hand in that particular position. The gesture itself was now clearly intentional, a signal Margaret had been trying to send. Jennifer consulted with experts in Victorian mourning symbolism and finally found the answer. The hand position, with the thumb pressed against the palm and fingers curved over it, was an obscure gesture used in some mourning traditions to indicate a death that was untimely or suspicious, a visual code that suggested the deceased had not died naturally. Margaret had been signaling from the very beginning that Edward's death was not what it appeared to be. Jennifer Chen completed her dissertation in 1992, incorporating the story of Margaret Ashford's portrait and the hidden accusation it contained. The work received significant attention in academic circles and was later published as a book that reached a broader audience. The portrait itself became a featured exhibit at the Museum of Fine Arts, displayed with detailed explanatory materials about Margaret's courage in documenting her suspicions and the sophisticated methods she had used to hide her message. Visitors came to see the painting not just as a work of art, but as a historical artifact that revealed a glimpse into Victorian-era crime and the limited options available to women seeking justice. The case against Charles Ashford could never be prosecuted. He had been dead for nearly 70 years, and any potential witnesses were long gone. But in the court of history, Margaret's accusation was taken seriously. Subsequent research by other historians uncovered additional evidence supporting her claims, including testimony from descendants of Ashford employees who had heard family stories about Charles's criminal activities. The consensus among scholars became that Edward Ashford had likely been murdered, though the exact mechanism remained unclear. Whether Charles had directly arranged the accident or had conspired with others to make it happen, the evidence suggested that Edward's death had been deliberately orchestrated. Margaret Ashford's story resonated with modern audiences as an example of resilience and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming obstacles. As a widow in 1892, she had little legal standing and no political power. Going public with accusations against a prominent businessman would have been dangerous and likely futile. Instead, she had chosen to document the truth in a way that protected her, while preserving the possibility that justice might eventually be served. Her decision to hide the accusation in the portrait showed remarkable foresight and creativity, turning a conventional mourning portrait into a time capsule that would eventually reveal its secrets. The safe deposit box that Margaret had maintained was eventually located through research into her financial records. Bank archives showed that she had rented a box at a small private bank in Cambridge, and that the box had been sealed after her death in 1922. Through legal proceedings, Jennifer and Dr. Brennan obtained permission to open it. Inside were the documents Margaret had compiled over 30 years, shipping records, financial statements, correspondence, and a detailed written account of everything she knew or suspected about Charles's crimes and Edward's death. The materials confirmed everything the portrait had suggested, and provided even more extensive evidence of Charles's criminal enterprise. Perhaps most poignant was a letter Margaret had written, dated just weeks before her death, addressed to whoever might eventually discover her evidence. In it, she explained her actions and her reasoning, describing the fear and isolation she had lived with for 3 decades, the constant awareness that she was harboring dangerous knowledge. She wrote about her love for Edward and her determination that his death should not be forgotten or unavenged, even if that vengeance came only in the form of historical truth. She expressed hope that someday someone would look closely enough at the portrait to see what she had hidden there, and that the truth would finally emerge. The portrait of Margaret Ashford remains on display at the Museum of Fine Arts, a testament to one woman's quiet resistance against injustice. Visitors stand before it, studying the hand that holds the key to the mystery, marveling at the layers of meaning embedded in what appears to be a simple mourning portrait. The painting has become more than Samuel Whitmore could have imagined when he worked on it in his Tremont Street studio in 1892. It has become a symbol of how art can preserve truth across generations, how the powerless can find ways to speak even when silenced, and how looking closely at what seems ordinary can reveal extraordinary stories. Margaret's hand, frozen in paint for more than a century, finally delivered its message, proving that some secrets are worth keeping until the right moment arrives for them to be told. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.